show is dedicated to the Uncle Toms. Yes, the sleeping car porters. Yes, the true Uncle Toms. But let me tell you about these Uncle Toms. They were the first black organized union, and not only that, they stimulated the Montgomery bus boycott in the 50s. But no further delay, here comes Miles of Smiles.
And 100 years of history, stretching from the days of slavery to the civil rights movement of today.
You go down next week
I was born here in Washington, D.C., 1011 4th Street Northwest, on November the 4th, 1881. Pullman started the Pullman Palace Car Company just after the Civil War, and it became one of the richest and most powerful companies in America. Pullman was a shrewd businessman. He not only built the cars, he also maintained ownership of them and hired the men to provide service to the passengers. They used to call the cars hotels on wheels because they were so elegant. And of course, the service was very elegant. The conductors who sold and collected tickets were always white men. But the personal service, which is what really made the Pullman Company famous, was provided by black men. Of course, in the early days, these men were former slaves. The porter had to do everything. He greeted passengers, carried baggage, made up the sleeping berths, tidied up the cars, served food and drinks, shined shoes, and had to be available night and day to wait on the passengers. For all this, the Pullman Company paid the porter a very small salary. He had to depend on tips from the passengers to make a living. By the 1920s, Pullman employed more black workers than any other company in the United States. And the symbol of this elegant service that the company was selling was the humble Pullman porter. The porter met celebrities, politicians, and wealthy white people who would otherwise never associate with blacks. The porter was a gracious host and friend to these passengers, and people happily entrusted their children to his care because he was seen as such a kind and gentle figure.
Give us more air, will you, quick?
Porter, the window, please close.
Porter, this pillow is as hard as a rock.
Porter, come give us more clothes.
Porter, come here, sir.
Porter, stay there.
All night the people complain. With Porter, dandy Porter, he run on the vestibule train.
No matter that he was a gracious host on the sleeping cars, when the train pulled in, the porter lost the so-called privilege of being the friend and confidant of white passengers. He was still a black man and a second-class citizen. no matter how intelligent or well educated he was. It was difficult for a black man in the 1920s to get the kind of job he deserved. For the most part, his choice was between the overalls of a laborer or the crisp uniform of a Pullman porter. The Pullman Company was able to exploit the situation and pay low wages to highly qualified men. The result was that men who could have been lawyers or accountants, and in some cases were lawyers or accountants, had to accept a job earning only $6 to $7.50 a month in 1925.
Back in the old days, on the Crescent Limited, Sunset Limited, all of the southern trains, Silver Media as well, Seaboard Coastline, they had a petition that would come all the way and almost blind these two tables. And these two tables were for colored dining people. And all that portion of the dine up there is for white people to eat. And this is a long way that railroad has come to in modern times. It's hard for people to really realize that these kind of conditions existed during that time.
The low pay and long hours were unjust, but even worse was the absolute lack of job security. If a porter were accused of breaking a rule, he was assumed to be guilty and never given a hearing.
But along with that, you had to be so careful because anybody that got on the train then just wrote you up, say you didn't shine his shoes, or you didn't brush him off when he got on, or he didn't like your attitude, or you didn't smile when you spoke to him. He'd call you and dress you down and put you in the streets probably for 10 days. You didn't miss a whole lot of money because they won't pay you nothing now. But the principle was you won't eat more than that much.
Passengers called every porter George, as if he were George Pullman's boy. They expected him to always smile for them. So the porters themselves often called the job, ironically, Miles of Smiles. But sometimes it was not so easy.
Well, Hayes was a big politician, it appeared, and he didn't like colored people. And he had an audience, and he was just wanted to show some of his friends how they act down south, how they treat niggas, you know. And so he missed the Cospedor and spit on the floor, and of which I had to clean it up, and I made mention to it that after reading this Cospedor, it was there for him to spit in it. And he was going to show his friends how to treat a nigger, you know. And he booted me, of course, and I was in the process of cleaning it up. You either accept it or you reject it. It depends on what kind of porter you are. Well, I accepted it. But of course I didn't like it. Well, what can you do?
But in 1925, we heard about some man in the East writing about organizing the Pullman Porters into a union. And of course I had been there just long enough to see what the conditions were, and I had sense enough to know that this guy was on the right track, whoever he was, talking about organizing the porters into a union. And his name was A. Philip Randolph.
Mr. Randolph was born the son of a preacher in Florida in 1891. He moved to Harlem when he was 20 years old and became interested in socialism. Even then, he wanted to unionize black workers. Of course, at that time, that was an unheard of idea. there were no black unions and hardly any blacks were allowed to join the white unions. But a group of porters led by Mr. Ashley L. Totten came to Mr. Randolph and asked him to help them organize. And he said that he would. In fact, he said, the Pullman Porter seems to be made to order to carry the gospel of unionism in the colored world. His home is everywhere. So on the night of August 25th, 1925, in the Elks Lodge at 129th Street in Harlem, Mr. Randolph called a meeting of 500 porters, and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters was born.
In 1927, I was running to St. Louis, Missouri, and a man from Nashville came in my car who was a porter also in the early morning. He told me, he said, you know, Randolph, who was trying to organize the porters, is going to speak in St. Louis today at the Pine Street YMCA. He said, I'm going up to him. He said, I wish you'd go along with me. I said, maybe I will go along with you. And when I heard him talk, he convinced me that he knew what he's doing. Although I didn't agree with some of the things he said. For instance, at that time, we were making $72.50 a month. And he said that if you stick with me today, it's soon coming out have you making $150 a month. I couldn't believe that, but I went along and I put $1 in the collection plate.
The company wanted to penalize these men. And in fact, the company started another sort of a union, which of course was not a union. So there was the people who felt that they had to be in the company union. But the men under Mr. Randolph continued to talk to the men. But all of this had to be done secretly. That is where I came in here in Washington. The men here were afraid, and somebody had to go around and keep them informed as to what was being done. So all of the literature, all of the propaganda was sent to me. And I would secretly go among the men and disseminate this news and collect dues. Now that's how I became active in this brotherhood.
And of course, the Pullman Company had what is known as a porter instructor down. That's what's his title. But we called him a snitcher because everything he found out about porters, he reported. And even though that he's supposed to be a porter instructor, he sat in that meeting and he made a note of every porter who was there.
Now, we had a meeting at a certain home once, and the company found out that we had this meeting. So they called the husband in, the porter in, and asked him about it. The porter was able to show by his time sheet that he was out of town. But his wife held the meeting.
So when I got home, before I got off the train, the superintendent there told me, I understand you attend the meeting of the Brotherhood just in St. Louis. I said, yes, I did. So we're going to I'll tell you right now, we ain't going to have none of our porters attending the Brotherhood meeting. I said, well, if somebody told you I attended the meeting there, maybe they told you also that I joined yesterday. Before he could answer me, I said, and of course, before I joined, I thought about what lawyer I wanted to handle my case if you started messing with my job, man. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to drag anybody in the court and mess with my job. I didn't even know a lawyer name at that time. But I bluffed him out. It didn't bother me. And from then on, I was a strong supporter of A. Philip Randolph.
Mr. Randolph directed the Brotherhood out of his office in Harlem with a small group of men. Mr. Milton P. Webster of Chicago was the first vice president and Mr. Randolph's right-hand man. And Mr. C.L. Dellums was a vice president and leader of the Brotherhood's division on the West Coast.
I started work for the Pullman Company in January of 1924, and I got fired as a result of my union activities around the 1st of October of 1927. Well, when I went over to see the superintendent, Mr. O.W. Snoddy, he spent all of the time, he sat there for at least an hour, talking to me about my union activities. And he said, all we're doing is furnishing you transportation over this country to spread this Randolph Bolshevik propaganda, you know. And Randolph gets his money from Moscow. I said, don't you know how to pronounce that word? That's not Moscow, it's Moscow. I began to kind of rib him some. I saw my discharge on his desk when I went in, so I knew that, you know, I'm there to be discharged. So after he spent all of that time, and then he handed me my discharge, and I started to get up, he said, Dellums, now I want you to remember one thing. You're not being fired for your union activities, you are fired for unsatisfactory service.
Although their jobs were on the line, the men of the Brotherhood fought back, at one point even threatening the company with a strike. They gained the support of white labor unions and fought for fair labor laws from the federal government. But it was tough going because Brother Randolph was preaching a new philosophy that was even opposed by many black leaders, including ministers and newspapermen. He said that black people should not beg white businessmen for fair pay and better working conditions. They should organize and demand them. Porter Tucker came home one day and said that he'd been taken off of his line. So I went to the station, to the office of the superintendent. I told him that I wanted to know why my husband, B.J. Tucker, had been taken off his line. He said, now, why are you taking this matter up? Why doesn't Tucker take it up? I said, the sign-out man, I knew his name at that time, said that nothing in hell could move Tucker from that line but his wife's activities in the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. You put my husband back on his line or I'll be back. Well, it was amusing because he seemed to have a fear because a black woman would come to a superintendent with the power he had and speak to him in that manner. Well, the next time my husband got back on his run. Now, there had been other times that porters had been penalized for certain things. Their wives would go and beg for them, plead for them. Please take my husband back. But Sister Tucker didn't do that. Finally, on August 25th, 1937, 12 years to the day since the first Brotherhood meeting in Harlem, the Pullman Company surrendered. They signed the first agreement ever made between a large American corporation and a union of black workers.
So, maybe a couple of years after that, Mr. Carey, we were down there for something, and the man who was the head of the Pullman Company was named Champ Carey. I guess his name was Champ, that's all we ever heard. And he said to Mr. Randolph, would it be an imposition for me to ask for a conference, Mr. Randolph, with you and Mr. Webster and Mr. Dellums? I just want to sit around and talk. we're friends nowadays. I said, you mean friendly enemies? And, well, we got along, he said, nowadays, and let's talk. I think we're doing pretty good. And he said, now, let's be frank about this thing. Here was a handful of colored people, Negroes, got together here and took on the Pullman Company. You know the Pullman Company is one of the most powerful industrial institutions in the nation. How the hell did you figure to win? We knew you were crazy in hell. There was no way to win. But you did. And we're still wondering, how the hell did you do it? So, Mr. Randolph said, well, Mr. Carey, we've thought about it a lot. We've talked about it a lot. We got to serve ourselves how we want, he said. But I guess we could summarize it by saying dedication and integrity.
After the Brotherhood had won the right to organize the porters, the Pullman Company found that they had been defeated. And to make themselves look good, they sent A. Philip Randolph a check, a signed check. All he'd have to do was put the amount of money he wanted in the check, and on the bottom of it said not to exceed $1 million. I said that it had been hard for you to find a man or a woman or a person for that concern that wouldn't have accepted that check and draw a real amount of money off it. But Randolph made a photostatic copy of that picture, that check, and framed it, hung it on his wall, and sent the written check back to the Pullman Company and told them the Negro principle was not for sale.
This labor movement, the American Federation of Labor, had always resisted black membership until the Brotherhood broke down those barriers. The Porter changed the image of blacks from strikebreakers to strong Union men. And in 1941, Mr. Randolph forced President Franklin Roosevelt to create the Fair Employment Practices Commission by threatening a mass march on Washington by thousands of black people. Years later, he organized the famous 1963 March on Washington. In 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama, Mrs. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus for a white man. Her arrest sparked the Montgomery bus boycott, which marked the beginning of the modern civil rights movement. Most people associate the boycott with Dr. Martin Luther King, but it was the Pullman Porter, Mr. E.D. Nixon, who originated the idea and who organized the boycott.
They arrested her and threw her in jail like a common criminal. So I made bond for her, and I said to Miss Parks after we got her home, I said, you know what? I said, I'd like to use your case to break down segregation on the bus. And then I recorded a number of names on tape recorder that night. And the next morning I got up and started calling them, telling them about what had happened. I said, it's my decision now that we organize a bus boycott and fight this discrimination on the bus. And Ralph D. Abernathy, which most of you probably heard of, was the first man I called. He said, yeah, Brother Nixon, I'll go along with you. I said, that's fine. And I called next man, Reverend H.H. Hubbard. I expected him to go along with me because, number one, he's president of the Ministers' Alliance, and number two, he was my pastor at the church I went to, because I didn't expect him to fight me. Ralph really told me to go along with him. The third person I called was Martin Luther King, and he said, Brother Nixon, let me think about it a while and call me back. So I went on and called 18 people and called them back. He said, yeah, Brother Nixon, I decided I'm going to go along with you. I said, I'm glad you decided to go along with Reverend King. I said, your church is the only church right downtown. I told 18 other people to meet at your church this evening at 3 o'clock, and it looked kind of bad to have that many people coming up to your church for a meeting of this kind, and you weren't there. So he said, well, I'm going to be there. I said, all right. So we set up this meeting, and that was Friday, December the 2nd, and Sunday morning, December the 4th. The headline was Negroes boycotting the Montgomery city line. And of course, I got hold of the paper that morning, and it's a very good story. I called every minister in town. Have you read the paper this morning? And some no and some yes. And read it. Take it to church with you. Tell the people at the church that we want 2,000 people at the Whole Street Baptist Church tomorrow night. If I had known about anything about organized labor, you wouldn't have had them out there. Then after that, that's why Reverend King came in the picture. He was elected that night.
But I want it to be known that the humble Pullman Porter, the man who had been kicked around and shoved around and worked without adequate pay, was the man that stimulated and worked for and fought for this boycott in Montgomery.
I was able to make a contribution solely because we had the brotherhood, and I wasn't afraid. And again, I have to come back to a fellow Randall. He died at the age of 90 years, 1 month and 1 day old. And last time I remember saw him, he didn't hardly know who I was. But he's my friend.